Warm greetings from Chennai Center for China Studies and hearty welcome to another episode interview with us. I am Navya Syam, Research Officer from the C3S, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Theodore Murphy on the topic China's expanding militarization in Africa. So Mr. Theodore Murphy is the Director of Africa Program at European Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the Director for Special Assignments at the Berghof Foundation in Berlin, as well as an Associate Fellow at Geneva Centre for Security Policy. He has served in the Doctors Without Borders in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan. And Mr. Theodore had been the team leader for Amnesty International's Sudan project. And he has served in conflict resolution and mediation team with United Nations in Africa, Middle East, and South Asia, and had also been the part of panel of experts for Libya appointed by the UN Secretary General. So thank you, Mr. Theodore Murphy, for joining us today, and it is an absolute honor to have you here. So today we are here to explore China's expanding militarization in Africa. So we look forward to delving deep into different strategies of military cooperation by China in the continent and how China is going to deepen its military influence in the continent in the future. So as to give an introduction before as we move on with the discussion, Africa has become a critical arena for China's military and security strategy beyond its border, like the establishment of the PLA overseas base in Djibouti and the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which is one of the first multilateral forums outside China's periphery. And the PLA's presence on the continent is considerable, with deployments in Djibouti and other UN peacekeeping missions and counter-piracy operations. And Beijing is likely to seek additional bases in regions like the Gulf of Guinea. And through multilateral forums and military education programs, China is building influence with African military leaders and increasing arms sales. So, however, this growing influence could challenge there are concerns of challenging sovereignty of African nations, and it may foreshadow a more globally active PLA security presence. So, hence, with that, let's dive into our discussion. So, sir, the first question to you, it is rather a direct question. So PRC sees security and military cooperation with Africa as very important in order to protect their investment and infrastructure they made through the Belt and Road Initiative. And PRC has strongly stated the need to strengthen and improve China-Africa military cooperation on multiple occasions. So is the security cooperation solely for the economic interest, or do they have wider geopolitical goals and in and around the continent? And also, will we be seeing more deployment of Chinese troops with regard to combat mission troops? Yeah.
Okay, there's a lot there. Look, I think China is following the playbook of earlier great powers in terms of their military relationships. I don't think it's so much about just spreading a footprint so that they can use Africa as a launching pad for offensive actions, towards other parts of the world. I just think they see it as a very interesting way to strengthen and to diversify the elements of their relationship with African countries and with the continent as a whole. So there's been, interesting research done on the amount of military training and education exchanges between Africa and African countries and China, and that's proving to be very successful. I think China has found a competitive advantage in providing more training opportunities than other countries. So in a way, China is winning on quantity, whereas African countries still see, big Western powers as qualitatively better. But you get less training spots at those places. So if you go to an elite US training or French training or British training, there aren't as many places. And China has been working on volume, been offering a lot more in terms of the numbers of people they can train on a regular basis. So that's one thing. I think when you look at the footprint as well, it's a little bit ambiguous what the Chinese military presence is doing. Everyone is probably familiar with the base in Djibouti. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not this is the first step in, China establishing a blue navy, so kind of projecting force far beyond its original sphere of influence, or what it would like to be its sphere of influence, or is it something else? And I think the ambiguity is kind of a feature. It's not a bug in China's approach here. And probably there's a degree of experimentation going on as well, of China trying out things and seeing how they work. So for now, it's an interesting logistical hub. It seems to be the flag following the economy. So the Navy, the military, following a kind of density of Chinese business and economic interests. And there's just simply a lot of Chinese interests on the ground. So you need to be there to protect, to help in case something goes wrong, as China experienced in Libya during the fall of Gaddafi. But once you're there, you can see, right? You can explore other things. You can see what will be interesting for you, and you can see what would be the asks, the requests that come from the African side, and adjust accordingly. I'll leave it there.
Next question is again, it is about Djibouti base, because given the evolution of China's Djibouti base from a support facility in 2017 to a key logistics and combat support hub by 2024. And so the question is, what security and geopolitical factors might have driven this shift, and how do these considerations also influence China's anticipated establishment of another base in Equatorial Guinea?
Yeah, I think what was interesting with the Djibouti base, there was a key milestone, I believe it was around 2008, when the driver for international naval presence was Somali piracy. So there was really an apex point where Somali piracy posed a great challenge. And it was challenged to a global common good, right, to maritime free passage. And that area where they were active is incredibly important for global maritime trade, because it flows up into the Bab el-Mandeb to the Suez Canal, and then that's one of the main routes to Europe. So if you look at that trade passageway, who uses it the most? Well, Chinese-European trade. It's not essential absolutely for connections back to the United States, for example. So that's really the main player there. And what was interesting in 2008 for people who are more expert on naval issues than myself is that there had been a multilateral kind of maritime peacekeeping operation set up. It was led by the US, but it was incredibly successful in bringing other partners under its umbrella that usually wouldn't work so easily with the US. So you had, I believe, you definitely had African countries happy to participate, and you even had some from the Middle East. And China and Russia didn't join the mission formally, but this is what everyone thought was foreshadowing potentially a possible cooperation. They were working quite well together with the mission. So they would exchange information, they would lightly coordinate their patrols. They wouldn't come under one operational umbrella, of course, they still had that distinction. But it was really interesting. So people said, oh, okay, great. So is this the beginning of a trend towards, China being a kind of responsible international actor, taking on the shared burden of maintaining peace and security here in terms of the sea lanes? Or is this something else, And I think if we fast forward now to the current problems in the Bab el-Mandeb that are driven by on the one hand, the war in Gaza and the Houthis and other things, we don't see that same kind of cooperation forthcoming from China. There's a different approach taken, which seems much more about winning the narrative battle, which is using basically what's happening there to say that China's brand in terms of maritime trade is better because it's not going to be, it's not responsible for global ills like the war on Gaza, and therefore it is not being targeted by the Houthis in Yemen in the same way that others are. And so it's not completely true. Sometimes the Houthis don't seem always to be able to perfectly distinguish which ships belong to China, and identifying ownership is also tricky because, as you know, like you can have a ship that's flagged in one place and run by a Chinese company and so on. But in a narrative battle, it's not always essential that you get every detail correct. Like it's the big picture story that works. So, and then turning to Equatorial Guinea, I know much was made about this, and of course, the assumption that one would want to make is that since Equatorial Guinea is on the Atlantic side of Africa, right, on the west side of Africa, you could say theoretically this is the next closest shore to North America, right? And so that's people who wanted to dramatize that development would point to this. But I mean, what I would say just on that big picture point is that the U.S. Navy and its allies are so much stronger in that Atlantic body of water that to even have the smallest chance of making inroads in that balance of power from Equatorial Guinea, I mean, it's really a stretch. This is a very small, tiny outpost as compared to the plethora of American and other naval bases on that side of the Atlantic. That it's a little bit difficult to see how this begins kind of a Chinese first inroad into the Atlantic. Maybe really far down the road, when a lot of other developments take place, we'll look back and say, yes, this was the very first feeler. But I find it stretches credulity a little bit. Like it's much more likely that this was based on the bilateral relationship, both with Equatorial Guinea and then in the Gulf of Guinea as a region. There's a lot of Chinese interest. Fine, that makes a lot more sense to me, and it's a lot more easy to prove than to say this is the first step in a kind of forward soft defensive into the Atlantic.
Okay, so thank you, sir. And the next is actually because there have been visits by the Chinese naval fleet with a guided missile destroyer and replenishment vessel and special forces personnel and helicopters on board, and naval ship Peace Ark, which is making frequent visits to the African ports. So actually, what could be the motivation behind kind of Chinese patrolling along the African coast?
Look, I'm not sure. You probably need to look at each of these individually if you want to have a really tight analysis of what it means. But it's a little bit context specific. I mean, we had joint naval exercises off of South Africa where the Russian and the Chinese were cooperating. That to me looked like a narrative thing more than anything else. The timing of it had been incredibly symbolic. It was linked to what was going on in Ukraine. But beyond that, I would go back to my original comment that I think that the Chinese are exploring different ways how in which their military naval relationships just add a second layer or an additional layer to their bilateral relationships. We can talk a little bit about Chinese PSTs, private security companies, and how they're being employed. but I think there as well that we'll probably come to that still. But I think that's much more about having trusted Chinese security for Chinese economic and business interests, rather than a sort of Russian type model where you use this, like they use Wagner, as a real tool of foreign policy that they bring in very close to the foreign affairs and defense.
The next question is actually on military soft power techniques by PRC on Africa, because they have been using military education programs and foreign arms sales in the continent. So the question is whether these soft power techniques can force African nations to choose kind of sides. Choose either between the China and the West in the great power competition within the continent. And could there also be, expansion of what China has been doing in the Benin, the Sahelian state, and could there be an expansion of the same strategy to other Sahelian states like Mali and Burkina Faso?
Yeah, I think China's selling point in terms of choosing sides in the great power competition is precisely that you don't have to choose sides. They're very clear about that, and they're trying to say that they don't have their own. They don't see China leading a global order. Not sure we should believe that, but that's what they say. And rather, what they say is what we're doing as China is trying to work with others in the global south to reshape the global order and to make it more fair. And so if you look at the provision of military aid like this, as you were saying, light weapons and other things, generally it follows a strategy of basically trying to make themselves useful and find a niche where Western partners have taken themselves out of the game. So a good example would be in a Sahel government where there's been a coup and there was a previous relationship, let's say, with the U.S. military. The fact that there was a coup triggers certain legislation in the U.S. which compels the U.S. to reevaluate its support, and the same thing would go for Europe. So this would be a classic situation where there's an opening in the market has occurred, and China, but not just China, I think Turkey as well and Russia would look at that and say, well, that's very interesting. We don't have the same constraints in terms of norms that don't allow us to work with this coup government. So there looks like an opportunity to gain influence on the cheap, so to speak. And that's a great place for them to roll in. We're seeing something similar in the Sudan conflict right now, where you have both Russian but also Chinese military support coming in. And the Russians have managed to somehow provide arms to both sides in the conflict. So they're equal opportunity, or they're all opportunity, we should say, and quite willing to, basically engage with anybody who has money to pay and who's willing to work with them.
Thank you, sir. So next question is like the Russian private military company Wagner Group, and we know all the incidents that have been reporting in the continent by the group. And so the question is there possibility of Chinese military, private military companies gaining ground in Africa? Because they are kind of different from other PMCs, because they are highly state-owned and they strictly come under the state laws. And but still, what is their position in the security landscape of Africa?
I think I was saying earlier, I don't see that China is following the same model as Russia in this case. So they haven't turned their private security, and I think it's a difference. I think it's more private security companies rather than private military contractors. I don't see that they've turned them into part of their offer to partner countries in the same way as the Russians have. For the Russians, it's really one of the strongest foreign policy cards they have to play in Africa. You can deploy this tool. It's deniable when you want it to be, and it's kind of like the equivalent of a foreign policy and defense with army knives. It can do logistics. It can provide security to the elites, to the president in a no questions asked way. It can go out and fight and do other things like that. And I think what we've seen with the Chinese PSCs is more that they're there to they operate around Chinese business and economic interests. So if there's a Chinese run mine, you'll have a Chinese PSC there. And the relationship between the PSC and the state, of course, it must exist. It's a state capitalist political economy, but I don't think it's the same kind of direct one-to-one. The capital, Moscow gives an order, and the PSC goes and carries it out. It's too early to say whether China would like to go more in this Russia-Wagner direction or not. But so far, we don't have a lot of examples. And then in terms of the way it's are trying to map where they are geographically, I think it follows largely the Belt and Road. So dotted along the Belt and Road projects, you'll probably find quite a heavy distribution of Chinese PSCs.
So thank you, sir. So the next question is the Russian troops and the Western troops who have been deployed in the continent. They were accused by the African states itself. They were accused of creating more violence and human rights violations, and they were asked to quit. Especially the Western troops, they were asked to quit many of the countries in the Sahelian region. So, have there been such instances in the case of China-Africa military cooperation?
Well, again, as I said before, it's different. I don't think the Chinese troops are out there in a kind of as either a mercenary force or kind of private peacekeeping force. So the Chinese forces, security, guarding Chinese interests, or participating in agreed multilateral peacekeeping operations. So agreed means by the United Nations and or the African Union. So I think it doesn't. I don't think that applies to the Chinese. There have been incidents still when they're in this private security role, where things have gotten out of hand, and their security forces have, killed African citizens. So I believe there was a case in Zambia where there was a protest around a Chinese mine, if I'm not remembering incorrectly, and something got out of hand, and some people were killed, and it was, of course, terrible. I think something similar happened in the Central African Republic, but it's a different category. It's not the same as, Wagner in Mali and the Sahel, going out and, being used by the government as an offensive arm of their military to fight an organized armed resistance. It's not that.
So thank you, sir. We are moving to the last question. So while the US and we know that the US and the West constantly criticizes China for their policies in Africa. So how does actually China maintain its own narrative of its peaceful rise and peace by force and being an anti-hegemonic power? How do they maintain this position and maintain the favor of African countries towards China?
Okay, it's quite a broad question. Do you mean that in relationship to Chinese private security companies, or just in general?
General, sir, in their cooperation with the countries.
Okay, I think, as I was saying earlier, China presents itself as kind of the leader of the global opposition to the liberal world order. They point to their example of development as something that's an incredibly persuasive alternative for global South countries. So they say there was a certain template that you've been given by the global North as this kind of neoliberal way of developing. It had all kinds of constraints. It had a lot of finger wagging associated with it. But there's another way. And don't just take our word for it. Look at our example. We did this without World Bank and International Monetary Fund programs. We did this without relying on the West. We did it without democratization, right? We did it our own way. And it is a pretty persuasive model. I mean, they have had incredible success, and I think there's a lot of frustration in the global South, and particularly in Africa, with the double standards that they've seen this liberal world order display towards them, right? It goes, there's just too many examples to name almost. It goes back to maybe the Western-led military engagement in Libya, which was seen as something that flew in the face of international consensus. More recently, if we look at what happened with COVID and the distribution of COVID vaccines, here we had something that was supposed to be a global public good. There was multilateral mechanisms created, which were supposed to guide how these vaccines are distributed in an equal way on the basis of need, and that was totally disregarded, right? We had vaccine hoarding in the global North, and you'll know this very well. India played a great role, I think, actually, in helping Africa with that, and China tried to as well. So, basically, in different ways, I think the Chinese playbook is to capitalize on discontent with the existing order, and wherever possible, show that it can help lead resistance and change to that order, while being careful not to say that China is establishing its own alternative order where it will be at the head. I think it's okay to say that there should be a different order. But I think China walks this tightrope of saying we want to work all together with that on an equal basis, to saying there's a new order and we're going to lead it. Like, they try to avoid that association.
Okay. With that, we have almost come to our end of the questions. So thank you, sir. And since you share his insights upon the possible strategic motivations of China behind enhancing the security cooperation with Africa, and he has shared his diverse opinions on various subject discussions we have just had. So thank you so much, Mr. Theodore Murphy, for sharing your valuable insights and expertise with us today. Your perspectives on China-Africa expanding military ties have given us a lot to think about, and we truly appreciate the time you took to be here. And we sincerely hope to stay connected and host you for future discussions with C3S. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in, and we hope you found this conversation as relevant and enlightening as we did. So stay tuned for more such relevant and interesting discussions with experts on various topics on China. So until we meet again, Navya, Syam, signing off. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here.